Socrates, the famous Greek philosopher, ran into his good friend Euthyphro as both arrived in front of the courthouse. Euthyphro, surprised that Socrates would have any business there, exclaims, "What? I suppose that someone has been prosecuting you, for I cannot believe that you are the prosecutor of another." Socrates confirms his assumption and says that a young man by the name of Meletus has brought charges against him, claiming that he was a maker of gods, that he did not believe in the gods the city recognized, and that he was a corrupter of the youth. Those familiar with Socrates' story will recognize the charges. There are those that he unsuccessfully defends himself against during his trial in the Apology, the reason for his incarceration in the Crito, and the cause for his execution in the Phaedo. Keep this in mind for later passages. Socrates then asks what is Euthyphro's business with the court. "And what is your suit, Euthyphro? Are you the pursuer or the defendant?" "I am the pursuer." "Of whom?" "You will think me mad when I tell you." "Why? Has the fugitive wings?" "Nay, he is not very volatile at this time of his life." "Who is he?" "My father." "Your father? My good man?" "Yes." "And what is he accused?" "Of murder, Socrates." For an Athenian audience, this would have been particularly shocking. To prosecute one's own father would have been seen as a profound violation of filial piety, threatening the very household, which Athenians believed to be the foundation of the city itself. Even when a killing had occurred, disputes with the family were expected to be handled privately or ritually, not dragged before public court. By bringing formal charges, Euthyphro appears to be placing abstract religious correctness above blood ties, an act many would have seen as not pious, but dangerously impious. He then explains his situation further. "I am amused, Socrates, at your making a distinction between one who is a relation and one who is not a relation, for surely the pollution is the same in either case. If you knowingly associate with the murderer when you ought to clear yourself and him by proceeding against him, the real question is whether the murdered man had been slain justly. If justly, then your duty is to leave the matter alone. But if unjustly, then even if the murderer lives under the same roof with you and eats at the same table, proceed against him. Now the man who is dead is a poor dependent of mine who worked for us as a field laborer on our farm in Naxos. And one day, in a fit of drunken passion, he got into a quarrel with one of our domestic servants and slew him. My father bound him hand and foot and threw him into a ditch, and then sent to Athens to ask of a diviner what he should do with him. Meanwhile, he never attended to him or took no care about him, for he regarded him as a murderer, and thought that no great harm would be done even if he did die. Now, this is just what happened. For such was the effect of cold and hunger and chains upon him, that before the messenger returned from the diviner, he was dead, and my father and family are angry with me for taking the part of the murderer and prosecuting my father. They say that he did not kill him, and that if he did, the dead man was but a murderer, and I ought not to take any notice, for that a son is impious who prosecutes a father. Which shows, Socrates, how little they know about what the gods think about piety and impiety." It is at this point in the text that the characters start discussing the central subject of the dialogue, piety. What the text generally means by piety is righteousness, or to simplify, things that are good and moral in a religious sense. Both suits have piety as a central theme. Socrates is summoned to the court because of his alleged impious behavior, while Euthyphro goes against the expected action of a person in his situation and justifies them by calling them virtuous. It's important to mention that the text strongly implies that Euthyphro is himself a religious figure and some kind of authority on piety, which makes him the perfect person and the perfect opportunity for Socrates to inquire about piety. Socrates says that Euthyphro could teach him his knowledge of piety so that when he finds himself before the jury, he could call upon Euthyphro as an authority on the matter to help his case. And Socrates thinks that Euthyphro must have some kind of undeniable insight on true piety to do what would have been considered a drastic action. So, Socrates decides to ask a very simple question. What is piety? Euthyphro responds, "Piety is doing as I am doing. That is to say, prosecuting anyone who is guilty of murder, sacrilege, or of any similar crime, whether he be your father or mother, or whoever he may be, that makes no difference, and to not prosecute them is impiety. He then goes on to justify his conduct by quoting Greek mythology. For do not men regard Zeus as the best and most righteous of the gods? And yet they admit that he bound his father Cronos because he had wickedly devoured his sons, and that he too had punished his own father, Uranus, for a similar reason, in a nameless manner. And yet, when I proceed against my father, they are angry with me. So inconsistent are they in their way of talking when the gods are concerned and when I am concerned. Socrates, unsatisfied with this, politely asks him to rephrase, as there are many more things that are pious than prosecuting one's own father for murder, and that a broader definition is needed. After a bit of nudging, Euthyphro then gives Socrates a much better answer. Piety, then, is that which is dear to the gods, and impiety is that which is not dear to them. Socrates is much more content with this, but still finds an obvious problem with it. Greek mythology is filled with conflict between the gods, and what is dear to one god might not be dear for another. This causes a logical contradiction, since the same action could then become both pious and impious. Therefore, he reuses the mythological example given by Euthyphro to criticize his second definition of piety. Then, my friend, I remark with surprise that you have not answered the question which I asked, for I certainly did not ask you to tell me what action is both pious and impious. But now it would seem that what is loved by the gods is also hated by them. And therefore, Euthyphro, in thus chastising your father, you may very likely be doing what is agreeable to Zeus, but disagreeable to Cronos and Uranus, and what is acceptable to Hephaestus, but unacceptable to Hera, and there may be other gods who have differences of opinion. Since this second definition contradicts itself, a third attempt is needed, and this time, no amount of nudging by Socrates makes Euthyphro give up his knowledge on the subject of piety he claims to have, so Socrates decides to give him some help. I will amend the definition so far as to say that what all the gods hate is impious, and what they all love, pious or holy. This means that right and wrong action need unanimous agreement by the gods, and it also creates a third category of moral action where the gods disagree that Socrates qualifies as either both or neither. However, it is from this definition of piety that we are forced to confront a dilemma phrased by Socrates like so. The point which I should first wish to understand is whether the pious or holy is beloved by the gods because it is holy, or holy because it is beloved by the gods. This is the paradox, and if we explore either option, we are left with two unsatisfactory results. Let's assume that the first part of the question is true, and that pious things are loved by the gods because of their holiness. The problem with this assumption is that pious acts are already pious and that the gods' love towards them have no bearing on their holiness. Not only that, but it only pushes the problem back further. If the gods love pious things because they are pious, why are they pious? Where does this quality come from? And it becomes obvious that we are left asking the same question that started this inquiry: what is piety? The second option thankfully does answer this question, but in such an unsatisfactory way that it begs that there must be more to the answer. If the pious things are pious because they are loved by the gods, are there criteria that the gods look for before loving them? And if there aren't any criteria, do the gods simply love pious things arbitrarily? If so, moral acts are no different from immoral acts, and if the gods wished, they could have made murder good and charity evil. Keep in mind that this dilemma extends further than ancient Greek polytheism. Everything we've discussed can be applied to monotheism. This is how 17th century theologian Leibniz rephrased Euthyphro's dilemma for Christian purposes. It is generally agreed that whatever God wills is good and just, but there remains the question whether it is good and just because God wills it, or whether God wills it because it is good and just. In other words, whether justice and goodness are arbitrary, or whether they belong to the necessary and eternal truth about the nature of things. Answers to this paradox concerning the Christian God are fascinating but exceed the scope of this video, and will have to be answered another time.